Hello everyone! Dear students, today we will start with a new chapter, Chapter 6 from our book Snapshots. Today we will be reading The Ghat of the Only World, written by Amitav Ghosh. Before we start, let's meet the author. Amitav Ghosh, best known for his work in English fiction, was born in 1956 in Calcutta. He is one of India's best-known writers whose ambitious novels use complex narrative strategies to probe the nature of national and personal identity, particularly of the people of India and Southeast Asia. As a child, Ghosh, whose father was a diplomat, lived in India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Iran. Later on, he was teaching at the University of Delhi, the American University in Cairo, Columbia University in New York City, and Queen's College of the City University of New York, among other institutions. After a stint at Harvard University that began in 2004, Ghosh turned to writing full-time and split his time between the United States and India. He received the 54th Jnanpith Award, among many, for his works. The chapter that we are going to read today is written by the narrator in the memory of his friend Agha Shahid Ali, a Kashmiri American who identified himself as an American poet writing in English. This is Agha Shahid Ali, a recipient of numerous honors and awards. He was born in India in New Delhi in 1949. He grew up in Kashmir in a highly educated family in Srinagar. He wrote 9 poetry collections, a book of literary criticism, and a collection of ghazals, among other works. His poetry reflects his Hindu, Muslim, and Western heritage. Known particularly for his allusions to European, Urdu, Arabic, and Persian literary traditions, Ali's poetry revolves around thematic and cultural poles. In a work known as Contemporary Poets, critic Bruce King remarked that Ali's poetry swirls around insecurity and sort of an obsession with memory, death, history, family ancestors, nostalgia for a past he never knew, dreams, Hindu ceremonies, friendships, and self-consciousness about being a poet. Agha Shahid Ali was diagnosed with cancer. He died in 2001. He was noted as a poet uniquely able to blend multiple ethnic influences and ideas in both traditional form and elegant free verse. One of his works that we will be mentioning today is The Country Without a Post Office. The poem, originally called Kashmir Without a Post Office, was published as a title poem in The Country Without a Post Office. Taking its impetus from the 1990 Kashmiri uprising, which led to political violence and closed all the country's post offices for several months, Ali's long poem is considered one of his masterpieces. In the book, the poet envisions the devastation of his homeland, moving from the realm of the personal to an expansive poetry that maintains an integrity of feeling in the midst of political violence and tragedy. Kashmir is vividly evoked, all the more so for retaining an element of the fantastic. As we already know, Kashmir is one of the most heavily militarized places in the world. Since 1990, Kashmir has come under the purview of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which allows, among other things, any soldier or officer to fire upon any group of 5 or more people or anyone suspected of having a weapon, arrest anyone without a warrant, and conduct home invasions. It also gives military personnel full immunity from persecution for their actions. The question that rises is, does any government has the right to take away people's liberty with military force? Today we will be talking about Kashmir and Aga Shahid Ali. Now let us go back to our chapter. The narrator, Amitav Ghosh, and Aga Shahid Ali became friends at a time when they stayed at the same neighborhood in the United States. Both of them have a lot in common and enjoy spending time together. Shahid has been diagnosed with cancer. He urges the narrator to write about him when he dies. The narrator keeps his promise and pays a tribute to his friend by writing this piece about him after his death. A dying man, an expatriate from Kashmir, asks the author to write something about him after he is gone. The following piece is what Amitav Ghosh wrote to keep his promise. A dying man refers to Aga Shahid Ali. An expatriate means a person who lives outside their native country. Aga Shahid Ali asks the author to write something about him after he is gone, and this is what the narrator wrote to keep his promise. The first time that Aga Shahid Ali spoke to me about his approaching death was on 25th of April 2001. This is the first time when Aga Shahid Ali speaks about his death, his approaching death. Approaching means coming nearer in distance or time. The conversation began routinely. Routinely means that the conversation began as nothing new, as a part of some regular procedure, rather than for a special reason. I have telephoned to remind him that we had been invited to a friend's house for lunch and that I was going to come by his apartment to pick him up. The narrator telephoned Aga Shahid Ali to remind them that they had been invited for lunch. To remind means to cause someone to remember something or someone. They were invited to a friend's house for lunch and the narrator was going to pick him up from his apartment. Although he had been under treatment for cancer for some 14 months, Shahid was still on his feet and perfectly lucid, except for occasional lapses of memory. Aga Shahid Ali was diagnosed with cancer, and although he had been under treatment for cancer for some 14 months, he was still on his feet. He was still walking and he was perfectly lucid. Lucid means able to speak clearly. He could express clearly. He was easy to understand, except for occasional lapses of memory. Lapse of memory refers to a period of time when a person forgets things that he or she should have remembered. For example, you can say, as he grew older, he began to have memory lapses. Here, Aga Shahid Ali had occasional lapses of memory because of his brain cancer, brain tumor. I heard him thumbing through his engagement book, and then suddenly he said, "Oh dear, I can't see a thing." There was a brief pause, and then he added, "I hope this doesn't mean that I'm dying." The narrator says, "I heard him thumbing." Thumbing means turning the pages with or as if with one's thumb. To flick or browse pages. He heard him flick the pages of his engagement book. Engagement means some appointment book, a book where he would note down his engagement, his commitments. And suddenly he said, "Oh dear, I can't see a thing." He paused, there was a brief pause, a short pause, and then he continued, "I hope this doesn't mean that I'm dying." Although Shahid and I had talked a great deal over the last many weeks, I had never before heard him touch on the subject of death. I did not know how to respond. His voice was completely at odds with the content of what he had just said. So the author said that he and Shahid were talking a great deal. It means they were talking a lot over the last many weeks, but still he had never before heard him touch on the subject of death. To touch on the subject means to briefly talk or write about something, to mention. He was never talking about death, and this is the first time he hears him talking about death, when he said that I hope this doesn't mean I'm dying. The author continues, I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know how to reply to this. His voice was completely at odds. At odds means in conflict. His voice was in conflict with the content of what he had just said. What he was saying was not matching the way he said it. Light to the point of jocularity. It means he was speaking very light. To the point of jocularity. Jocularity means in a funny manner. It means the quality of being happy and liking to make jokes. Jocularity refers to playfulness. So Aga Shahid Ali was talking about a very serious subject in a playful way. So the author didn't know how to respond. I mumbled something innocuous. Innocuous means harmless, something that is not harmful or offensive. The author mumbled. He spoke quietly. He murmured something quite innocently. He said, "No, Shahid, of course not. You'll be fine." He cut me short. To cut someone short means to interrupt someone or something, or to bring something to an end in an abrupt manner. After the narrator told him that, "Of course not, you'll be fine. This doesn't mean you're dying." But Aga Shahid Ali interrupted him. He cut him short. In a tone of voice that was at once quizzical and direct, he said, "When it happens, I hope you'll write something about me." Here, Aga Shahid Ali interrupts him and he says, in a tone of voice that was at once quizzical. Quizzical means puzzled or perplexed, questioning. Quizzical refers to some question which is being asked without saying anything. He was quite direct. He said, "When it happens," means when I die, I hope you'll write something about me. I was shocked into silence and a long moment passed before I could bring myself to say the things that people say on such occasions. Shahid, you'll be fine. You have to be strong. The narrator was shocked into silence. It means he was stunned into silence. A long moment passed, quite some time passed, before he could bring himself to say, before he could manage to say the things that people usually say on such occasions. On such occasions, people usually give some encouragement. The narrator said, Shahid, you'll be fine. You have to be strong. From the window of my study, I could see a corner of the building in which he lived, some 8 blocks away. It was just a few months since he arrived here, since he moved there. He had been living a few miles away in Manhattan when he had a sudden blackout in February 2000. After tests revealed that he had a malignant brain tumor, he decided to move to Brooklyn to be close to his youngest sister, Samita, who teaches at the Pratt Institute, a few blocks away from the street where I live. We know that the narrator and Aga Shahid Ali lived close by in the United States. So the narrator says that from the window of his study room, he could see a corner of the building in which he lived, in which Aga lived, some 8 blocks away. Block here refers to a building. Block means a large single building subdivided into separate rooms, flats, or offices. So Aga Shahid Ali lived some 8 blocks away, not so far away. He could see the corner of his building from his study room. It was just a few months since he moved there. He had been living a few miles away in Manhattan when he had a sudden blackout in February 2000. Blackout means he had a sudden period when he became unconscious. A blackout means a short period when someone suddenly becomes unconscious. If you have a blackout, it means you temporarily lose consciousness. Aga Shahid Ali had a sudden blackout in February 2000. He did some tests. After tests revealed that he had a malignant tumor. To reveal means to disclose, to make something that was previously unknown known to others. The tests revealed that he had a malignant brain tumor. Malignant means tending to become severe and progressively worse. In regard to a tumor, having the properties of a malignancy that can invade and destroy nearby tissue and that may spread or metastasize to other parts of the body. So the test showed that he had a malignant brain tumor. He decided to move to Brooklyn to be close to his youngest sister. Shahid ignored my reassurances. Reassurances means actions of removing someone's doubts or fears. Shahid ignored these reassurances that you will be fine. He began to laugh, and it was then that I realized that he was that serious. Shahid ignored what he was saying, and then the narrator realized that he was dead serious. Dead serious means that one is absolutely serious and not joking. I understood that he was entrusting me with a quite specific charge. He wanted me to remember him not through the spoken recitatives of memory and friendship, but through the written word. This is where the narrator realizes that he is not joking. His friend is not joking. He says, I understood that he was entrusting me. To entrust means to give some duty or responsibilities to someone. He was giving him quite a special duty. Aga Sayyid Ali wanted him to remember him not through the spoken recitative. Recitative means a passage in a musical composition. In music, it means words that are sung as if they are being spoken. We could say a recitative is a style of vocal music intermediate between speaking and singing. So he wanted his friend to remember him not to these spoken recitatives of memory and friendship, but through the written word. Shahid knew all too well that for those writers for whom things become real only in the process of writing, there is an inbuilt resistance to dealing with loss and bereavement. Now Shahid was dying of cancer, and he knew all too well, he knew very well, that for those writers for whom things become real only in the process of writing, it means that for those writers who only when they write they accept it is the real thing. Only for those writers there is this inbuilt resistance. Inbuilt means built in or existing, internal resistance to dealing with loss and bereavement. Bereavement refers to the death of a close relative or a friend. It means loss, deprivation, grief, or sorrow. That is why he says that Shahid knew very well that those writers for whom the things become real only in the process of writing, there is this resistance to deal with the loss. He knew that my instincts would have led me to search for reasons to avoid writing about his death. I would have told myself that I was not a poet, that our friendship was of recent date, that there were many others who knew him much better and would be writing from greater understanding and knowledge. All this Shahid had guessed, and he had decided to shut off those routes while there was still time. The narrator understood that Shahid already knew how to ask his friend to write about him. He knew that his instinct would say, no, I will not write about him. I was not so close to him, so what should I write? He knew that my instincts would have led me to search for reasons to avoid writing about his death. He knew that. And the narrator admits that he would have told himself that he was not a poet and that their friendship was of recent date. That there were many others who knew him much better and would be writing from a greater understanding and knowledge. All this Shahid knew. All this he had guessed. And he had decided to shut off those routes while there was still time. That is why he asked him in this way. To shut off the routes means to, in a way, prevent the author to think in this way. It didn't matter how much he knew him, as long as he was not making an excuses to write about him. You must write about me. Clear though it was that this imperative would have to be acknowledged, I could think of nothing to say. What are the words in which one promises a friend that one will write about him after his death? Finally, I said, Shahid, I will. I'll do the best I can. The narrator could not refuse. He says, this was imperative. It means this was a must, something that is extremely important or urgent. There was no time for making excuses. He says, clear though it was that this imperative would have to be acknowledged, I could think of nothing to say. He didn't know what to say. What do you say to a person who is dying? What are the words in which one promises a friend that one will write after his death, that one will write about him after his death? So he said, I will. I'll do the best I can. We already know that this is the first time that Aga Shahid Ali mentions his death. Before that, the narrator says he was never talking about his death. Or death in general. So we find out that the narrator and Shahid lived a few blocks away in Brooklyn, USA. The narrator continues saying that by the end of the conversation, I knew exactly what I had to do. I picked up my pen, noted the date, and wrote down everything I remembered of that conversation. This I continued to do for the next few months. It is this record that has made it possible for me to fulfill the pledge I made that day. The narrator says that by the end of their conversation, he knew exactly what he has to do. So he picked up his pen, he took a pen, he noted the date, and he wrote down everything he remembered of that conversation. And he continued to do so for the next few months. He would write down their conversations. The narrator says, it is this record that has made it possible for me to fulfill the pledge I made that day. It is because of these records, these writings that he would write daily, that has made it possible for him to fulfill the pledge he has given. To fulfill means to realize or attain or achieve, to carry out the pledge as required, promised or expected. A pledge is basically a very serious formal promise. I knew Shahid's work long before I met him. His 1997 collection, The Country Without a Post Office, had made a powerful impression on me. Impression means he was very impressed with his work, The Country Without a Post Office. His voice was like none I had ever heard before, at once lyrical and fiercely disciplined, engaged, and yet deeply inward. His voice, the way he was writing, was like nothing he had ever heard before. His voice was lyrical, means song-like, and at the same time it was fiercely disciplined. Fiercely means extremely, extremely disciplined. It was engaged. Engaged means occupied or busy, and yet it was deeply inward. Inward means ingoing, directed or proceeding towards the inside, coming in from outside. Not for him the mock, casual, almost prose of so much contemporary poetry. His was a voice that was not ashamed to speak in a bardic register. Mock casual means that someone is imitating one's casual voice in a mean way. He says it was not that mock casual, almost prose of so much contemporary poetry. It was not that kind of a poetry which is mock casual, which imitates one's casual voice in a mean way. Contemporary here means current poetry. It was nothing of that sort. His was a voice that was not ashamed to speak in a bardic register. Bardic register, it refers to a certain poetic style. A bard is a poet, traditionally one reciting epics and associated with a particular oral tradition. Bard is skilled in composing and reciting verses on heroes and their deeds. His voice was special. I knew of no one else who would even conceive of publishing a line like "Mad hard, be brave." The narrator says that he knew of no one else except Aga Shahid Ali who would even conceive. Conceive means to come up with. Publishing a line like "Mad hard, be brave." That is why he says that his was a voice that was not shy to speak in a bardic register, in a different kind of poetic style. In 1998, I quoted a line from The Country Without a Post Office in an article that touched briefly on Kashmir. At the time, all I knew about Shahid was that he was from Srinagar and had studied in Delhi. I had been at Delhi University myself, but although our time there had briefly overlapped, we had never met. We had friends in common, however, and one of them put me in touch with Shahid. In 1998 and 1999, we had several conversations on the phone and even met a couple of times. But we were no more than acquaintances until he moved to Brooklyn the next year. Here, the narrator describes how he met Aga Shahid Ali. In 1998, he quoted a line from his work, The Country Without a Post Office, in one article that touched briefly on Kashmir. Briefly means a little bit. The article was talking a bit, mentioning Kashmir a bit. At that time, the narrator says, all I knew about Shahid was that he was from Srinagar and had studied in Delhi. And the narrator himself had been at Delhi University, but although their time there had briefly overlapped, it means that they were there in certain period. To overlap means they were there at the same time, but just briefly. However, they had never met. They had friends in common, and one of them put the narrator in touch with Shahid. To put one in touch with someone means to help or arrange for one to meet or communicate with another person, a group, and so on. He connected them, one of their mutual friends. So in 1998 and 1999, they had several conversations on the phone. They spoke on the phone several times, and they even met a couple of times. But we were no more than acquaintances. They didn't know each other well until he moved to Brooklyn the next year. Once we were in the same neighborhood, we began to meet for occasional meals and quickly discovered that we had a great deal in common. So once they were living close by, they were living in the same neighborhood, they began to meet for occasional meals. They quickly discovered that they had a great deal in common. It means they discovered that they shared some same interests, or maybe they had some same opinions. Great deal in common means to have a lot in common. By this time, of course, Shahid's condition was already serious, yet his illness did not impede the progress of our friendship. By this time, Shahid's condition was very serious. However, his illness did not impede. To impede means to delay or prevent or to slow something down from happening, to hinder, to hamper. His illness did not affect the progress of their friendship. The narrator says, "We found that we had a huge roster of common friends in India, America, and elsewhere. We discovered a shared love of Rogan Josh, Roshanara Begum, and Kishore Kumar, a mutual indifference to cricket, and an equal attachment to old Bombay films. So as they spent time together, they found that they had a huge roster of common friends. Roster means some list. They had many friends in common, a long list of common friends, in India, America, and elsewhere. They discovered a shared love of Rogan Josh. Rogan Josh is an Indian dish. They both loved Rogan Josh. Roshnara Begum and Kishore Kumar, and they both had an indifference. Indifference means lack of interest. They had no interest in cricket, and they had an equal attachment to old Bombay films. They equally liked old Bombay films. Because of Shahid's condition, even the most trivial exchanges had a special charge and urgency. The inescapable poignance of talking about food and half-forgotten figures from the past with a man who knew himself to be dying was multiplied, in this instance by the knowledge that this man was also a poet who had achieved greatness, perhaps the only such I shall ever know as a friend." Here the narrator explains how special this situation and friendship was. Because of Shahid's condition, even the most trivial means insignificant, even the most insignificant exchanges had a special charge, had a special meaning and urgency, because he didn't have a long time to live. The inescapable poignance of talking about food, the inescapable poignance means inescapable means unavoidable, inevitable, something that is impossible to be avoided. Poignance means the quality of causing or having a very sharp feeling of sadness or regret. There was this sadness from which they could not escape. So he says, the inescapable poignance of talking about food and half-forgotten figures from the past, with a man who knew himself to be dying, was multiplied. All these talks that they were having about food and other things, about some half-forgotten people from the past, all these talks were much more significant. They were multiplied because he was dying. In this instance, by the knowledge that this man was also a poet who had achieved greatness. And the reason more was that this man was a great poet. As the narrator says, perhaps the only such that I shall ever know as a friend. One afternoon, the writer Suketu Mehta, who also lives in Brooklyn, joined us for lunch. Together we hatched a plan for an adda, by definition a gathering that has no agenda other than conviviality. So one afternoon, the writer, who also lives in Brooklyn, Suketu Mehta, he joined them for lunch. So together they hatched a plan. To hatch a plan means to make a plan, to come up with a plan. They came with a plan for an adda. Adda means a place where people gather for conversation. And he says, by definition, a gathering that has no agenda. Agenda means plan or outline. They would just gather without any plan or outline of things to be done. Other than conviviality. Conviviality means the quality of being friendly and lively. It means friendliness. When someone makes you feel happy and welcome, they would meet without any agenda. They would meet to sit and share things and laugh. Shahid was enthusiastic and we began to meet regularly. From time to time, other writers would join us. On one occasion, a crew arrived with a television camera. Shahid was not in the least bit put out. I'm so shameless. I just love the camera. So Shahid was enthusiastic and we began to meet regularly. He was very happy and they began to meet on a regular basis. From time to time, other writers would join them, and on one occasion, a crew, arrived with a television camera. Shahid was not in the least bit put out. To be put out means he was not at least concerned by the camera. He would say, I'm so shameless, I just love the camera. Shahid had a sorcerer's ability to transmute the mundane into the magical. A sorcerer is a wizard, or maybe someone who claims or is believed to have magic powers. Sorcerer's ability means a skill, a capacity or potential of a wizard. He had this ability of a wizard to transmute. Transmute means to change in form, nature, or substance. He could change the mundane into the magical. The mundane means dull, something which lacks interest or excitement. He would be able to change this dull situation into the magical one. Once I accompanied Iqbal, his brother, and Henna, his sister, on a trip to fetch him home from hospital. Once, the narrator says, I came along with his brother Iqbal and his sister Henna on a trip to fetch him, to get him from hospital. This was on 21st May. By that time, he had already been through several unsuccessful operations. Now he was back in hospital to undergo a surgical procedure that was intended to relieve the pressure on his brain. So that was on 21st May, when the narrator, along with Iqbal and Henna, Ali's brother and sister, went to get him from the hospital. By that time, the narrator says, he had already been through several unsuccessful operations. He already had few operations that were not successful. Now he was back in hospital to undergo a surgical procedure. To undergo means to go through. To go through a surgical procedure, a surgery. That was intended means planned or meant to relieve the pressure on his brain. To relieve the pressure on his brain means to cause the pain to be less severe because of the pressure. His head was shaved and the shape of the tumor was visible upon his bare scalp, its edges outlined by metal suture. The narrator says that his head was shaved because of the operation, and the shape of the tumor was visible upon his naked scalp. The tumor was visible upon his head. Bare means naked, and scalp means the skin on the top of a person's head where hair usually grows. The edges of this tumor outlined, they were defined by metal sutures. Metal sutures are stitches. Suture refers to a stitch or row of stitches used to sew up a cut in a person's body. These stitches are holding together the edges of a wound or surgical incision, and they were metal, like a staple. When it was time to leave the ward, a blue uniformed hospital escort arrived with a wheelchair. When it was time to leave from there, the ward refers to a separate room in hospital, typically one allocated to a particular type of patient. So when it was time to leave this ward, a blue uniformed hospital escort. Hospital escort refers to someone like a hospital guard or a person who is accompanying a patient for protection. This escort was wearing blue uniform, and he arrived with a wheelchair. Wheelchair is a chair fitted with wheels for use as a means of transport by a person who is unable to walk due to some injury or illness. So Shahid was getting discharged from a hospital, and the hospital escort arrived with a wheelchair. Shahid waved him away, declaring that he was strong enough to walk out of the hospital on his own. Shahid waved him away means he dismissed the escort. He dismissed him. To wave away means to wave one's hand back and forth as a signal for someone or something to move away. So he waved him away, saying that he was strong enough to walk out of the hospital on his own, without the wheelchair. But he was groggier than he had thought, and his knees buckled after no more than a few steps. Iqbal went running off to bring back the wheelchair, while the rest of us stood in the corridor, holding him upright. Although Shahid declined and rejected the wheelchair, he was groggier than he had thought. Groggier means groggy. Groggy means weak. He was weaker than he thought. Groggy means unsteady and unable to walk correctly, usually because of tiredness or illness. He was weaker and groggier than he had thought, and his knees buckled. It means his knees became bent. Often, as a result of weakness, knees buckle. Knees buckling is when one or both of your knees give out. And just after few steps, his knees buckled. Iqbal, his brother, went running off to bring back the wheelchair while the rest of them stood in the corridor. They all stood in the hallway, and they were holding him upright. They were holding him in an upright position. At that moment, leaning against the cheerless hospital wall, a kind of rapture descended on Shahid. Here, Shahid was leaning against the cheerless hospital wall. Cheerless means gloomy, depressing, dull. He could not even stand on his own. The narrator and others were holding him upright, and at that moment when he was leaning, when he was taking support of this depressing hospital wall, a kind of rapture. Rapture means some kind of expression or manifestation of joy, ecstatic joy or delight. A kind of rapture descended on Shahid. To descend means to drop, to come or to fall downwards. Although he was leaning against this depressing hospital wall, some kind of ecstatic joy was falling on his face. When the hospital orderly returned with a wheelchair, Shahid gave him a beaming smile and asked where he was from. So now this hospital orderly, the person who was bringing the wheelchair, he returned with a wheelchair and Shahid gave him a beaming smile. A beaming smile means smiling broadly, grinning. Beaming is used to describe the smile that is very wide and happy. So this time Shahid gave him a beaming smile and asked where he was from. Ecuador, the man said, and Shahid clapped his hands gleefully together. Spanish, he cried at the top of his voice. I always wanted to learn Spanish, just to read Lorca. Now, after Aga Shahid Ali asked the hospital orderly where he was from, he says from Ecuador. And Shahid claps his hands gleefully together. Gleefully means in a happy and excited manner. And he says Spanish at the top of his voice means he said it very loud. I always wanted to learn Spanish, just to read Lorca. Lorca is a famous poet and dramatist from Spain. Shahid's gregariousness had no limit. There was never an evening where there wasn't a party in his living room. I love it that so many people are here, he told me once. I love it that people come and there's always food. I love this spirit of festivity. It means that I don't have time to be depressed. Gregariousness means the quality of liking to be with other people. It means fond of the company of others or sociable. Shahid's gregariousness had no limit. He was very happy to be surrounded by people. There was never an evening when there wasn't a party in his living room. And he would say, I love it that so many people are here. I love it that people come and there is always food. I love this spirit of festivity. He said on many occasions that he enjoys this time, that he loves the spirit of festivity, means the atmosphere of this celebration. He would say, it means that I don't have time to be depressed. Dear students, this will be all for today. Next time we will continue with our chapter 6, The God of the Only World, written by Amitav Ghosh. Have a nice day and see you soon.